All right, well, let's get started here. As you all know, we are in a series in the Gospel of Luke called Luke, Learning About the God-Man. And one of the things that was a challenge for us is, as we go through this Gospel, people saying, well, how long is this going to be? I mean, how long will this take? And especially when you keep veering off. And we've had a couple of great guest speakers, and I went off. Well, today is another one of those days. I'm going to step aside from our series in the Gospel of Luke, because all week, I have been dealing with personal stuff. So kind of today, I wanted us to just have a chat. I just want to kind of chat with you guys, talk a little bit, speak my heart to you, because if I'm going through something, then there's a good chance someone else could be going through the same thing. And if the pastor of the church and those who are in leadership can have to deal with certain issues in life, then more than not, other people are also going to be dealing with a similar thing. So we want to step aside to cover a topic that I'm sure not only I, but other people struggle with as well. You know, at the beginning of the week, I had every intention of continuing in the Gospel of Luke. And I had every intention of in fact, I'm almost there. I mean, I got that message, it's almost done. But things in my life, personal stuff, that were disturbing me to the point that I was beginning to have trouble studying. You ever been there? That you have trouble in your life studying because of personal things that happen in your life. So I started to say, God, what's going on? And then the Lord did speak to me, and I don't want to blow the sermon in the first 2 minutes, so I'll eventually get to that. But one of the things that I realized quickly was, I said, you know, God, is this one of those times when maybe I should go off and just speak to the people about what's going on? And I really felt that it was a good time to do that. So today we're going to get off of the topic of learning about the God-Man in the Gospel of Luke. And instead we're going to talk about the topic of disappointment. And today's sermon is going to be entitled, The Danger of Disappointment. Right? And there's three things we want to learn today in today's time together. And that's, why are we disappointed? The danger of disappointment, and very important, how do we overcome disappointment? Right? So, like I kind of alluded to a second ago, I've been going through over the last week and a half, a personal time in my life dealing with disappointment. And disappointment is the kind of thing that can really hinder the believer. You know, there's so many things in which we can become disappointed in. We can become disappointed with people. We could become disappointed with ourselves. We could become disappointed with circumstances. But the reality is that it's easy in this sinful world we live in to become disappointed and to find ourselves in a place of disappointment. And to be quite honest with you, I spent the majority of my week in that place of disappointment this week. And it wasn't until the Lord really got a hold of my heart and gave me perspective that I was able to say, you know what, you're right, Lord. And because I've said this before, don't ever put me on a pedestal. Alright? Don't do it, because you're going to be disappointed. Don't ever put there's only one person we can put on a pedestal. His name is Jesus Christ. Because He's the one who's never going to fail you, and He's the one who's never going to let you down. But I'm going to try not to fail you. I might. And so as an aside, let me just say that my disappointment had nothing to do with myself this week. It was a personal matter. It had nothing to do with my wife. I don't want nobody to think anything like that. There's nothing to do with anything other than the fact that life happens and you have disappointments. So what is disappointment? is the sadness experienced when people or circumstances do not fulfill expectations. Disappointment is the sadness experienced when people or circumstances do not fulfill expectations. So, expectations there is the key word. Okay? When it comes to disappointment, the key word associated with disappointment is the word expectations. Okay? We come to have expectations of people. We come to have expectations of circumstances. We come to have expectations of things. And what happens is, because of our expectations, we are then able to become disappointed. Whether they're noble expectations or whether they're noble or not, expectations in life, whether they're people or things or circumstances, when those expectations do not live up to our standards or to the things that we have placed on them, we put in our minds sometimes an expectation of a person or an expectation of a circumstance or an expectation of a thing, and when those expectations aren't met to our requirements, then we are prone to experience disappointment. You know, the people of Israel had certain expectations of Jesus. You know, they really believed, many of the people of Israel who were following Jesus during his earthly ministry, really believed that his messiahship included him liberating them from Roman rule and Roman oppression. And many of them, when they realized that he wasn't quite the Messiah that they had in their mind of what the Messiah should be, many of them, upon realizing that, became disappointed and became disillusioned. And that disappointment and disillusionment quickly turned to betrayal against Jesus. Many people who were on Palm Sunday crying out, "Hosanna, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord," were the same people, after they were disappointed with him, that were crying out to Pilate a short time later, "Crucify him. Crucify him." In fact, even those who remained faithful to Jesus, even throughout the whole crucifixion and the resurrection, even they were disappointed to a certain extent, but not for long, right? But they were disappointed because they didn't understand what had happened. So I'm going to have you open up your Bibles to a story in the Gospel of Luke, ironically. It's the only place we'll open today. It's Luke chapter 24. If you're going to use the Bibles in front of you, it's going to be page 756. Luke chapter 24, verse 13 to 21. This is on the road to Emmaus. And this is a story of, let me just set it up for you like this. Jesus Christ was crucified. And after the resurrection, his tomb was empty. And his tomb is empty, and his followers are disappointed because they expected Jesus Christ to be a certain kind of Messiah. And when Jesus was, when he died on the cross, it kind of threw his followers into a tailspin. And then to add to the drama, for lack of a better word, then 3 days later, he's gone. His tomb is empty. They go to visit the tomb, and he's not there. And can you imagine what his faithful followers, what must have been going through their mind? We believed in this man. And not only are we disillusioned and disappointed at the fact that he died, now he's missing. And Jesus himself finds two men who are walking on the road to Emmaus. Look what it says, starting in verse 13 of chapter 24. It says, "That very day, two of them were going to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they were talking with each other about all these things that had happened. And while they were talking and discussing together, Jesus himself drew near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, what is this conversation that you are holding with each other as you walk? And they stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, named Cleopas, answered him, are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days? And he said to them, what things? And they said to him, concerning Jesus of Nazareth, a man who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. Listen to verse 21. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things had happened. Can you hear the disappointment in their speech? We had hoped. We had put our trust, we had put our faith in him that he would be the one to redeem Israel. We had hoped. So why do we become disappointed? Why do we experience times of disappointment? Because we put our trust sometimes and our hope in people and circumstances. And when they don't happen, or when the result is contrary to what we envisioned, it leaves us in a state of despair or in a state of disappointment. That's what happened to these. They were believers. They believed. They were faithful to Jesus. But upon his dying and upon his then now missing, they said, have you not heard? And we had hoped that he would be the one. And they were disappointed and disillusioned. And can't that happen to us? That we can become disappointed and disillusioned so easily because of expectations that we put on people and that we put on things. But more importantly, the question for us today is, how do we respond? Right? How do we respond when people and things disappoint us? And that's really the question for us today, isn't it? How do we respond to disappointment? And the question is, do we respond in a sinful way to disappointment? Because I'm going to be honest with you. I have oftentimes responded sinfully to disappointment. How do we respond to disappointment? And do we then become sinning or commit sins in our responding? Because that's the danger. That's the danger of disappointment. See, the biggest danger of disappointment is sin. Sin is the biggest danger of disappointment. We're disappointed when expectations aren't met, but how we respond to our disappointment is vital to our spiritual condition. How we respond to disappointment. Because will we be disappointed? Yeah. Unfortunately, at some time or another, we're all going to experience disappointment. But how we respond to disappointment is vital to our spiritual condition. We can go from being sinned against to offending sinner rather quickly, can't we? Especially when we're feeling hurt and when we're feeling disappointed. When you're feeling hurt, there's a number of ways to respond to hurt. Unfortunately, one of them is to lash back, right? So let's watch out for these three pitfalls, which are the dangers of disappointment. And the first one is gossip. All right? And I know that there's no gossipers here. There's no one here that's guilty of gossip. I understand that. But I'm speaking for the person who might see this on the video, if we are supposed to do that. So what is gossip? Gossip's talking about somebody. Gossip, let me read it. Gossip is talking about something or someone behind their back. Pretty simple, right? Gossip is talking about something or someone behind their back. Just in case you don't know what the parameters for gossip is, let me tell you. If you're speaking freely about someone, and they walk in the room and you find yourself shutting up really quick, you're gossiping. Okay? Or if you have to whisper it, or at any time in the conversation, you kind of listen to this, you were probably gossiping. Gossip, and I have long contended, if anyone's had this conversation with me, you probably know it's true. I have long contended that in the church, I'm not talking about Christians outside of the church. I'm talking about Christians in the church, that the greatest sin in the church is the sin of gossip. This is my opinion. I don't have statistics to back that up. But I believe that our greatest area of weakness in the church sometimes can be gossip. Gossip is easy to slip in, especially when you're feeling disappointment. When you're feeling disappointment, it becomes easy to talk about the person or the thing that is disappointing you. But the question is, how do we respond in a godly way to our disappointments? Because gossip is never a godly thing. Yet, we can do that, can't we? A second one, which is closely associated to gossip, is the word slander. Slander is false and malicious talk about others. But listen, look what slander does though. It not only harms those against whom it is directed, but also brings ruin to those who propagate it. You know, oftentimes we can respond to our disappointments by then slandering, whether it's the person or the situation that it is. And we can take a situation that is, we're hurt, or we're hurting, and instead of going to God, we'll go to others, and instead of praying for, we'll begin to drag somebody's name and reputation through the mud. Why? Because we're hurting. Because we're hurt. And we become slanderers. You know, my parents are just in town. I love my parents. They took my kids away for 4 weeks. Did I mention that? They just recently told me a story. My dad told me a story when he was here. And it wasn't a story about slander, but when I started to think about this, I said, wow, this is an opportunity. You know, we grew up in West Haverstraw, and there was another Latino family that didn't live too far from us, and they were kind of friendly with my parents, and so I knew these people growing up. So my dad told me when he was here, he said, he asked me if they still lived in that house, as if I would know. I would have grown it. But I said, I don't know. And he said, this is what my dad said to me. He said, you know, after we moved, we used to see them. And we would always wave to them. And the lady would just ignore us. Look at that. People who were cool, we were friendly at one time. And he said, I used to wave to them all the time. And they wouldn't wave back. They would just ignore us, act like we weren't even there. Isn't that an opportunity for slander now? If that happens to you and I, that opens up an avenue to say, well, let me gossip and slander this person. And I'm not saying that's what my parents did, because it has nothing to do with that. But here's the thing. My father said, it wasn't until recently that I heard that she's going blind. So all that time, I thought she was just ignoring me. She couldn't see me. And isn't that the case sometimes? We can misperceive something and think somebody is sitting against them, and it could be something completely opposite, completely different. But it doesn't change the way it's making us feel at the moment, and slander can quickly become such a sinful thing for us. We can quickly take things out of context or out of place and say, oh, you're ignoring me? Well, I never liked you anyway. And this and this and this. And we could quickly begin to drag people's name through the mud. Why? Because we feel disrespected? Because we feel dishonored, because we feel hurt, because we're disappointed. And slander can easily become the result of that. And listen, slander does not have to only be false talk against somebody. Right? Like if my parents would have slandered those people, they would have been talking falsely because the lady wasn't not saying hi, she just didn't see it. But slander could also be when you're saying something that might even have some truth to it, but you're not saying it for edification. You're saying it because you want to hurt, because you want to mar, because we want to, get it out. We want to drag someone's name through the mud because we're feeling hurt. So instead of responding biblically, because the Bible teaches us how we are to respond to disappointment. The Bible teaches us how we are to respond to adversity. The Bible teaches us how we are to respond. And slander and gossip are not in the program. Yet, sometimes we can quickly take that avenue. Why? Because that's a wider road. It's an easier road to get on. You ever been there? Because I have. And I'm just being honest that I have. Look what Psalm 15, 1-3 says. It asks a great question. Psalm 15, 1-3 starts with this question. O Lord, who shall sojourn in your tent? That's how the ESV reads. In modern English, that would say, O Lord, who may dwell in your presence? Or who may take a trip to be with you? Who may sojourn in your tent? Who shall dwell on your holy hill? That's a great question, right? Who's going to get to be with you? Who's going to enjoy your presence? And look what the answer is. He who walks blamelessly and does what is right and speaks truth in his heart, who does not slander with his tongue and does no evil to his neighbor, nor takes up a reproach against his friend. Slander and gossip are never okay. Never. You see, because that's the lie. When we're feeling disappointed and we're feeling hurt, we begin to have a sense of entitlement that we have the right to slander that person. You don't know what that person did to me. You don't know how that person made me feel. You don't know how that person has wounded me. Therefore, I am going to lash back with slander and gossip. And it's never right. It's never right. And it leaves, that's why the definition for slander says it not only harms those against whom it is directed, but it also brings ruin to those who propagate it. We are never better off talking dirty about somebody. We're never better off. And yet, the Apostle Paul in the New Testament warns and encourages us. When he says in Ephesians 4:31, he says, let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you along with all malice. Why is Paul saying that? Because if we want to live productive Christian lives, we have to put those things away. We have to put those things away. I'm not here to tell you that they're so easy to put away. But we need to get to a place where we know that's what we need to be working towards. Moving in this direction. We should be asking the Spirit of God like I do. Because I am a fallen human being. Spirit of God, when I slander, when I speak something, when something comes out of this big mouth that shouldn't, word for a guy who loves to talk. Where words are many, sin is not far away. Because if you talk long enough, you're bound to say something stupid, aren't we? Right? At least I am. And it says, let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you. And that's how we can sin against others. That's a danger of disappointment. But the third danger of disappointment is depression. Depression. Dictionary.com describes depression as a condition of general emotional dejection and withdrawal. Sadness greater and more prolonged than the warranted by any objective reason. The Bible often refers to depression as being downcast. If you've ever heard the Bible call something being downcast, when that has to do with depression. Now here's the danger with depression in the life of the Christian. The danger with depression in the life of the Christian is that depression will render you helpless and useless in the kingdom of God. Now here's the thing. We know that Christians are not helpless and Christians are not useless. But depression will deceive the believer into thinking that he cannot be used or she cannot be used by God. And depression has a way of making us stagnant in our walk with God. I've never dealt with depression, at least not clinical depression. But I was downcast this past week. And what was the result? I was having trouble studying. It wasn't that I wasn't reading. It's not that I wasn't praying, although I probably wasn't praying like I should. But every time, it was weighing on my mind so much that I couldn't get in the Word. I couldn't get my thoughts together. Because it was troubling me so. And I think I may have been having a little bout of depression. I was troubled in my heart because of situations. And it had a real effect on me. And it was, and if I would have listened to that voice of saying, just give up, I wouldn't have kept studying. I wouldn't have shown up today. Depression will render the believer useless. But we're not useless. That's a lie of the devil. That you are useless. It's a lie of the enemy of our souls. Listen. The Bible describes us as more than conquerors. More than conquerors. The Bible says that He has given us not a spirit of fear, but a spirit of power and of a sound mind. We do not have to, and in no way am I describing a clinical imbalance or anything. I'm just talking about everyday stuff that we allow the enemy of our souls. Listen, depression and the feelings that come from depression oftentimes become ammunition for the enemy of our souls. And that's the devil. He will use your negative feelings. And when you're feeling down in the dumps because of circumstances and because of expectations that haven't been met, the enemy of your soul, the enemy of my soul, will use that to get us to a point where we become a shell of our former self. So then the question then becomes this: how do we overcome disappointment? How do we overcome disappointment? The gospel. It's the gospel. How do we overcome disappointment? It's the gospel. It's the gospel. I don't know how many, I could sit here for the rest of the afternoon saying, it's the gospel. How do we overcome disappointment? Let me tell you something. I was feeling a little down this week. And I was feeling a little self-entitled. And I'm going to be honest, all right? I began to slander someone in my mind and even to my wife about the people who were really bothering me. And then I quickly realized that I was responding sinfully to a situation. And it wasn't that I felt entitled, it's that I was hurt. And in my hurt, I said, Lord, I began to pray. And I said, Lord, I know I'm responding wrong. Help me out here. Why am I so hurt? And I felt very simply that the Lord said to me, because you're forgetting the gospel. You're forgetting that had it not been for the gospel of Jesus Christ, you yourself would be doing the very same things that you are disappointed in right now.
Yes.
If it wasn't for me, if it wasn't for Jesus, you yourself would be doing all those things and worse. And you're forgetting where you came from. You're forgetting that I rescued you. And now you're acting self-righteous and thinking that other people need to meet your expectations. And you're disappointed because they're not where you want them to be. But you wouldn't be anywhere without me. And that's what I felt the Spirit of God saying to me. It's the gospel. That's why I say to you, preach the gospel to yourself every day. Why? Because when we preach the gospel to ourselves, we are reminded. We are reminded of the goodness of God. And we are reminded not only of our own sinfulness, but we're reminded of the greatness of God. And when I think about where God brought me from, and I remember that apart from His mercy and grace, which we talked about in this worship today, that apart from that, I would be doing all those things and worse for the things that I'm disappointed in. You see, when I forget the gospel, when I forget the gospel of Jesus Christ, and what's the gospel of Jesus Christ in one sentence? That Jesus came to save sinners. And when I forget that, I can put expectations on people that they cannot make apart from the help and the work of God in their lives. And the answer to, that's why Alexander Pope, in a letter he wrote, said this. He said, blessed is the man, as a play on the Beatitudes. He said, blessed is the man who expects nothing, for he shall never be disappointed. Blessed is the man who expects nothing. Oh, because ultimately, the disappointments that we face come from failed expectations. And so Pope was onto something here. Pope was onto something here. Because when we have expectations of people, they're not going to make them. Even if people or things or whatever, they're not going to make them always. Even other believers, they're not always going to meet your expectations. So rather than placing our expectations in people, let's place our hope in God. Rather than placing our expectations in circumstances and in things, let's place our hope in God. Because there'll be no disappointments. I like what Faber says. He says, there are no disappointments to those whose wills are buried in the will of God. Listen, there are no disappointments for those whose wills are buried. That's a fancy way of saying, preach the gospel to yourself every day. Preach the gospel to yourself every day. Because a believer who preaches the gospel to themselves every day is never disappointed. Why? Because they have a correct perspective. So when people do things and circumstances and life happens, which comes right, life comes at you fast, and things don't go your way or expectations aren't met, you're saying, instead of falling for the trappings of the disappointments the expectations, I'm going to pray. Instead of sinning against, I'm going to pray for. Instead of responding to my disappointments in a simple way, I'm going to respond to my disappointments by praying. By giving it to God. That's how we overcome our disappointments. we remember the gospel. Right? And when we remember the gospel, we become more patient, we become more compassionate, we become more loving, we become more long-suffering. And we will resolve to pray for rather than sin against. That is how we can overcome disappointments. By remembering the gospel. That had it not been for the gospel of Jesus Christ, where would we be? Where would we be? So that's how my week went. Not your week up. That's how my week went. And, but the gospel is the cure for all. You know, and that sounds, don't let that be religious cycle battle. Don't let that just be something that religious folks say. That's why we say that you could be religious, but having a personal relationship with Jesus Christ changes everything. Because if I was just religious, then I wouldn't have an answer. And I'm not saying that the heavens opened up when I was praying and God, because I'm going a little deaf in this ear, and God with his megaphone said, "It's the gospel." But because I have this relationship with my God, I was sensitive to him. And when I was feeling hurt and I was feeling disappointed, I was able to say, "God, why?" And I felt that. I felt because you're placing expectations that they're not going to be met. And you're going to continue to be disappointed when you expect people who don't know me to act as if they do. It's the gospel. The gospel will keep us level. The gospel will keep us from becoming self-righteous. The gospel will keep us humble and loving and caring. All right? That's how we overcome. We trust on him to move on our behalf. And we resolve that we're going to wait for him. We can never overcome sin by responding to sin sinfully. I really want you guys to leave today with that in your mind. We cannot overcome disappointment by responding to it in a sinful way. And I know that that is without a doubt, the biggest danger of disappointment. That we would respond to our disappointments in a sinful way. But I wanted you to hear this from a person who's been there and done that. We will never, ever get over our disappointments through the mode of sin.